My left foot is hard down on the brake, right foot on the accelerator, and here we go. And there's 60 miles an hour. Let's load it up. Here we go. Wheel spin. And there's 60. Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today, I'm going to hopefully be answering a question that I get asked very, very regularly. M340i or M340d. This particular M340i Touring is a press car, and this one actually belongs to a guy called Jamie, who happens to live very close to me, has watched my content for many years. He reached out to me as soon as he saw this on my Instagram page and offered me his car to film this video. So massive thanks to Jamie. I'll put a link to his Instagram page below in the description because he has lots of lovely pictures of his M340d. And in fact, he purchased that car off our good friend Tony Lewis only back in December. This test couldn't be any fairer because, well, both cars are between 1 and 2 months old, and both cars have done between 1,500 and 2,000 miles. So they're both essentially box fresh, but have been run in. I recently shot a first drive video on this M340i, so make sure you check that out after this video if you want to see more specifics about this particular model, the 3 Series Touring LCI, if you like, which stands for Life Cycle Impulse, which is BMW's talk for facelift. Before we start the comparison, I'd love to urge you to hit that subscribe button and the bell icon because 2023 is already shaping up to be an exciting year. The more subscribers I've got to bring along on the journey, the better. In today's comparison, we're going to look at the RRP of both cars, the specs of both cars, test out their claimed 0 to 60 figures on the same piece of tarmac in exactly the same conditions. And then at the end of the video, we're going to test out these cars' claimed MPG figures. So Jamie's going to jump behind the wheel of his car, I'm going to be in the press car, and we'll do exactly the same route and see what they give us. Because let's face it, most people that are going for the diesel alternative are probably doing it because it's meant to be more efficient. But in today's world, well, fuel prices also come into play because as of December 2022, I looked online earlier, and actually the average fuel price across the UK, there's 23 pence per litre difference between unleaded and diesel. Now 23 pence is about 15% difference between the two figures. So unless the D is at least 15% more efficient, then the MPG equation, when you're looking at both of these cars, doesn't really come into play. Something else we are going to look at as well are options on these cars. Not into too much detail. In fact, I'm going to put Jamie's spec and the press car spec in the description below in detail so you can look at what are on both cars, because they actually have very similar retail prices, but they've both gone in slightly different directions. This one, for instance, is in Brooklyn Grey. This one is in Frozen Pure Grey, which is lovely to look at, but I'm sure in the long term it's going to be a bit of a pain to look after. And then when you get inside, where you can see Cognac leather on Jamie's car, and you can see black Merino leather in this particular car. But the two options that I'm going to focus on in this video comparing are the Panoramic Sunroof, which is on the press car, which is obviously something that I always give the big thumbs up for on a touring or estate cars, and the M Sport seats, which are in Jamie's car, which the press car doesn't have. A seat that comes standard in the current M3 and M4. It's a brilliant, brilliant seat, and I can't see any disadvantages that it has compared to the regular sports seats that are in this particular car. So it'll be interesting jumping from one to the other, especially with different seats and a sunroof and no sunroof, because believe it or not, Jamie is actually taller than me. I know, I can't believe it. He's 6'5". So it'll be interesting to see if you actually get more headroom in his car without the roof, because that was one of the reasons he didn't go for the roof, because sunroofs, pan roofs, etc. tend to eat into a bit of headroom. But I'm not sure that's going to be the case, but we'll find out soon. As with everything in the car industry at the moment, prices have gone up, and actually a base M340d xDrive Touring like this It's going to retail at £59,375. And the equivalent M340i X-Drive Touring is about £400 more expensive. Under the bonnet of the M340i, we have a very familiar engine, the B58, and I'm sure you've heard me say that a few times on the channel over the years. This is also now strapped onto the mild hybrid system, which does make a difference, especially with things like stop-start. Also torque fills a little bit. It produces 374 horsepower and 500 newton meters of torque. That 500 newton meters of torque comes in at 1900 RPM, so that's relatively low, especially for a petrol unit, and you can certainly feel it, and that's the important figure that you need for day-to-day driving. That's mated to the familiar ZF 8-speed gearbox, and all of that power and torque is fed to the ground via BMW's X-Drive system. They claim this will do the 0 to 62 sprint in just 4.6 seconds, and it will do an average MPG on the combined cycle with WLTP of 34 miles to the gallon. This car weighs 1,870 kilos and has a maximum payload of 595 kilos. Under the bonnet of this M340d X-Drive Touring, we have the B57, which is also a 3-litre inline-6 turbocharged engine, but instead of being a petrol, it's obviously a diesel unit. It has the very latest mild hybrid system, which is actually more visible in this engine bay. Produces 340 horsepower, so what's that, 34 horsepower down on the petrol version. But, and this is the big but, it produces 700 newton meters of torque, and that's between about 1700 RPM and 2200 RPM. So loads of torque, even compared to the fairly torquey M340i. And that, I'm sure, is going to make a big difference in day-to-day driving. And it also means that it's using very little effort and revs to throw this big car down the road. That's connected again to the familiar ZF 8-speed gearbox, the only option with both models, and once again to BMW's X-Drive system. So we shouldn't have any issues getting all of that power and all of that monstrous torque down on the road today. BMW claim that this car will do the 0 to 62 sprint in 4.7 seconds, so only 1/10 of a second slower than the petrol equivalent. They also claim it will do 45.6 miles to the gallon on the combined cycle, which is just over 30% more than they claim the petrol version will do. So it'll be interesting to see if we also discover that on our drive a little bit later. This weighs 1,945 kilos, which is 75 kilos more than the petrol equivalent. And I assume most of that weight is due to the diesel lump, which always tends to weigh a bit more than the equivalent petrol lump. And therefore, most of that added weight is going to be over the front axle. But I'm sure we're probably not going to feel much of a difference on today's short drive, but it's something to bear in mind. Jumping into the M340i, well, firstly, it's lovely and warm in here because it's actually 2 degrees out there. We're not going to go into too much detail about the specific spec on either car. As I say, I have done a first drive video on this car where I go through the spec more extensively. But we are going to talk about 2 standout options that both of these cars have one of. This particular car, well, it's the pan roof. I absolutely love the pan roof, as many of you know, especially if you live in the UK and especially if you're carrying around rear seat passengers regularly, because it just opens the back of the cabin up nicely. It is about £1,200 and it does add some unnecessary weight to the top of the car, which is the worst place that you could add weight. But let's face it, most people aren't going to track their M340i's or their M340ds, and I think it's money and excess weight well spent. The other option that we need to talk about, which this car doesn't have, are the optional M Sport seats. Now, I understand that they're only available with the Comfort Plus pack, so you need to tick the Comfort Plus pack and then you need to tick the M Sport seats. That's what Jamie's done in his car, but this one doesn't have it. This car does, however, have the standard sport seats, which aren't bad, but they're coated in an optional merino leather, which is also about £1,000 option. So for me, I would sacrifice the lovely leather and spend that £1,000 on the M Sport seats. And it'll be interesting to see what the driving positions are like, if they have changed, because this one has a very good driving position. I would like to be sitting a little bit lower, but that's the case with most cars with me. And certainly my M3 with the carbon buckets, you are sitting a bit lower with those seats. And the merino leather does feel nicer than the Vernasca leather that's on the standard seats or the M Sport seats, as we'll discover in a minute. Sitting as low as possible, and I reckon between the top of my head and the headlining, there's probably about 1.5 inches of available space. So not a massive amount, but it'd be interesting to see what it's like in there. But before we do that, let's get this car out on my designated piece of tarmac and test out its claimed acceleration figures. BMW claim this M340i xDrive Touring will do the 0 to 62 sprint in 4.6 seconds. I have my Racebox Mini set up to measure 0 to 60 miles an hour, so we should be able to duck down below the 4.6, but it'll be interesting to see what sort of times we come up with. There's plenty of grip out there today, it's completely dry, so I've got all the traction control systems switched off. My left foot is hard down on the brake, right foot on the accelerator, and here we go. And there's 60 miles an hour. 3.92 seconds. Sub 4 seconds to 60 miles an hour. I mean, that is seriously rapid. For consistency, we will go back and try it again and see if we can produce an even faster time, or see if it sits around the same sort of time. Second attempt, let's see how close we can get to that 3.92 seconds. Left foot is hard down on the brake, right foot on the accelerator, and here we go. And there's 60. 4.02, so it's 1/10 of a second slower, but still very consistent and still a lot faster than BMW claim. It's that initial launch doesn't feel massively quick off the line, but once it gets going, once those turbos kick in, that torque kicks in, this thing is a rocket ship. I mean, 0 to 60 miles an hour in around 4 seconds flat is fast enough. It really is, and it does feel that fast and that punchy. Let's just see what it feels like through these twisties now, and see if I can see any differences between the two cars along the exact same piece of road in the same conditions. Firstly, well, it has plenty of low down torque. It's going to be hard for me to get my head around something that has 200 newton meters of extra torque, because to me, well, this feels punchy enough. There's also no getting away from the sound, because the B58 has always sounded brilliant. BMWs have always produced a sporty or a fruity sounding straight six, and the very latest B58 is no different. Yes, it's muffled up with OPF filters, and BMW have to pass so many sound restrictions so they can't make it as loud as they want to, and there is some fakery going around the cabin, but when you put your foot down, it sounds so good. It really does, and there's no mistaking that for anything else but a BMW straight six, even a turbocharged one. It really does sound good. It feels great in the bends, feels a lot lighter than the 1,870 kilos I think it is that they suggest this car is, and and I've got a fair amount of camera gear in the boot. Obviously myself, I'm about 110 kilos these days, unfortunately. And actually, while we're talking about that, this car has just over half a tank of fuel. The diesel has just under a full tank, but I have about 20 kilos of camera gear in here, so it more or less cancels out any kind of unfair weight advantage. But yeah, the 340i, it's a brilliant car, it really is. It doesn't feel like it's lacking any of that low down torque. It makes for a great daily. It seems to do things so well, as I've talked about so many times. I'm really excited about jumping straight into the M340d now to see if I can notice any differences and to see what that extra torque feels like. Also to test out its acceleration times. Now we're inside Jamie's M340d, and I have to say, this cognac leather looks so good in here. It contrasts very well with the optional carbon trim and all of the piano black trim. All looks so good, makes the interior feel like it's more expensive. And these seats, the optional M Sport seats, well, they fit me so much better. They're more comfortable and they're more supportive. They also have electric headrests that obviously change depending on which key and driver you have set up on the car. It just feels nicer. In terms of the driving position, well, it's very hard to say exactly. Jamie and I have just been discussing off camera, because he's now sitting in the 340i, and we both believe that these seats sit about an inch lower than the regular sport seats, and not having the panoramic sunroof also gives you another inch of headroom. So I've now got about 3 inches above my head, and it definitely feels like there's more space up here. So it's an interesting one. If you are 6'5" like Jamie or taller, then it's definitely worth considering, because he's now in that car and he said his head is just touching the headlining on that, which obviously would get annoying if you own the car and on longer drives, etc. So these seats definitely nicer. They don't have the merino leather, which would be lovely if you could spec these seats with the merino leather, but that would be like £2 extra, but you can't. But for me, I'd sacrifice the higher quality leather and get these, which come on the Vernasca leather, which I think is just the rebranded Dakota leather that used to come in cars like the M340i. Just because, yeah, they look better, they support you, and they are actually more comfortable. Although they are sportier seats, they definitely feel more comfortable to me. The sunroof, well, we've already said that not having it does give you a bit more headroom. It obviously gives you less weight and a lower center of gravity, but it does get a little bit depressing in the winter months, especially for backseat passengers. There's a caveat to that again though, and that is if you go for a cognac leather or a lighter leather, there's not many options off memory, it does bring back some of that sort of light. So it's not a dark cave back there because the leather is inducing more light. So it really is a bit of juggling around and trying to get what suits you and what sort of works out best for you. But I think if you could only have one of the options, then I would go with what Jamie's gone with. Got the better seats and also the cognac leather because it lightens and brightens up the interior a little bit. But if you can justify having both of them, I definitely would still have the pan roof and these seats, because I think they're the most important two options on these particular models. Right, let's now take this out and see if we can match or beat BMW's claim figures, and more importantly, if we can get anywhere close to the M340i. I'm sure we can beat BMW's claims, but can we get close to the 392 or the 402 that I managed in the 340i? Everything traction wise is switched off, just as it was with the other car, because conditions are exactly the same. Left foot is hard down on the brake. My Racebox Mini is ready to go. Let's load it up. Here we go. wheel spin. And there's 60. 4.28 seconds. There was some wheel spin there. It just couldn't deal with all of that torque off the line, because that was maximum torque, 700 Newton meters off the line, and all four wheels spun up initially. Something else that we have to factor in with it being a diesel is it doesn't rev as high. It runs out of puff at about 4,500 RPM. So it's gonna have to change gear quicker, and it does. It seems to change at about 15 miles an hour. Short shift almost, because it has all of that torque available in second and then third. I'm not sure what gear we got into there, but I'm guessing it was third to reach 60 miles an hour. And that's probably where we're losing that small amount of time. 4.28 seconds is still very fast, but I'm sure there's more to come. So let's head back and try it one more time. I'm still surprised that we got wheel spin off the line in these conditions. Just gives you a good idea of how much torque this car has. Before we go for the second time, I just wanted to point out that actually the I has got Bridgestones on it, and this D came with Pirelli P0s, so maybe there's a slight tyre differential there, but I wouldn't have thought so. I think they're both very similar sort of tyres. I think it's really down to that extra 200 Newton meters of torque. This car just struggles to get off the line. So actually I'm going to put the traction settings into traction, which is essentially like Sport Plus used to be. So there's a bit of slip there. So the ECU or the electronics can basically play around with the traction and hopefully optimize our launch a bit better than it was before. Let's see. Left foot is hard down on the brake, right foot on the accelerator, launch control active. Here we go. And there's 60 miles an hour. 4.44 seconds. So it was actually a little bit slower, about 1/10.5 of a second slower. Just like with the petrol, it seemed to get a little bit slower on the second launch, but obviously that time we changed the traction control settings to try and optimize that launch, but it didn't seem to do what we were hoping. But still, that's a very fast launch, and our fastest time of 4.28 seconds is absolutely mighty. Let's just talk a little bit about its handling dynamics down this road, see if we can feel any differences between the two cars. Does it feel any heavier? You know, the front end does maybe feel a little bit weightier, but that'd be a big call, because we're talking about literally a few hundred meters in both cars. It does maybe feel a little bit weightier though around the front end, but not in a bad way. Just definitely feels like there's a little bit more weight over that nose, which we know there is. But in terms of the engine, well, that torque is just, it is mind-bending. It's mind-boggling as well. It's really hard to get your head around the fact that there's just so much available torque from such a low RPM. And as we've already talked about briefly, well, this car has a much lower red line compared to the petrol. It's about 2,000 RPM lower, so it does run out of puff and it runs out of gears a lot quicker. In fact, second gear, if I leave it in second, it changes at about 46 miles an hour, whereas the petrol equivalent, well, you get around 60 miles an hour. So you can see that you have to go through more gears to get to the same speed. But the torque that this car has, I mean, well, I'll put it into fifth now. We're sitting at 30 miles an hour in fifth gear. I put my foot down, 40, 50, speed limit at 60. It picks up so quickly. It's just bizarre. There's just so much torque everywhere. And of course, that amazing torque figure and those low down torque figures, the fact that it's available from 1750 RPM, that's maximum torque figure available there. It just means that this is such an easy car to live with when you knock it back into comfort and the gearbox back into normal drive, it just settles into such a nice rhythm and everything is just effortless. It's such an easy car to live with. It's such an easy engine, gearbox, etc. to have as your daily. Just does everything so well. If I want more speed, I just ease the throttle on and it doesn't even think about changing gear. It just uses that torque, and that makes it such a lovely, relaxing engine and gearbox setup. It's not changing gear every 2 seconds and trying to utilize and find some torque and power, because it's just there all the time. It really is, and that never grows old. And anyone out there that still frowns upon diesels and 6-pot diesels from companies like BMW, well, most of those people have never driven one. I'm now back in the M340i. Jamie's in his M340d, and we're going to do a MPG test. We haven't got much daylight left. Got the GoPros running. We've reset both trip computers, and we're going to stay in comfort, not touch the gears or anything, and drive in a fairly identical fashion. He's going to be behind me. I'm going to lead the way. We're going to do some motorway and then some A and B roads. So hopefully we should see some differences between the two cars in terms of MPG. I have the radio as well, just to keep in contact in case we do get broken up, because, well, it's fast approaching rush hour. So let's pull out of here into drive, and away we go. This is going to be a very fair test because I don't really want either car to win. I know that Jamie wants to justify the fact that he's purchased the right car, and yeah, I think there really is going to be no, let's say, unfair advantage in either car. In front of us we have got the continuous MPG, so what I'm doing right now, and the average. The average is the circle with a line through it. At the moment that average is at about 11 or 12. That's only because we've been parked up and we've accelerated once, so that's definitely going to grow in numbers. So now we're going along nicely at 70 miles an hour. My direct or live MPG is at about 36 as we go up this slight incline. Yeah, Jamie's back there. He's not close enough that he's going to be in my slipstream, because that would also be slightly cheating, but he is far enough back that he's got good vision, etc. So we're a few miles into our motorway jaunt. I'm currently sitting at a live MPG of about 38, and my average is at 26.2. What's your one look like?
So my average is 35.8 and climbing quite quickly. My instant is sort of hovering between 50 and 52.
We're approaching the 10-mile mark now. Before we look at what the figures are saying, what's your car revving at 70 miles an hour? I'm at, I would say, 1600 RPM.
I just had to switch my display because I actually had the power meter up, but I'm revving at just under 1500 RPM at 70.
Okay, so not a massive difference there. Now in terms of MPG, so I am 31.8 average and currently doing 61 along here.
So I'm at 43.8 average, and I think the coasting function keeps kicking in because mine's flicking from sort of 83 MPG instant to sort of 90.
90 is ridiculous. You'd never see that in this car. Well, that's good. So, I mean, okay, so we're looking at about 10 miles to the gallon difference on the average, which is 369. It's about just over 30%, which is exactly what they claim. So that's interesting. I guess what we'll do now is yeah, switch the cameras off for 5 minutes, or the main cameras off, and then rejoin when we're leaving the motorway. Right, so we're coming off at this junction. We're at the 17 mile mark, and I've averaged 35.8 miles to the gallon. Jamie, what's your average showing?
48.5 at the moment.
Wow, that's impressive. I'm at 35.8, and I think that's about as high as I will probably see in this car as we're peeling off onto smaller roads. But it'd be interesting to see what happens when we do get onto those smaller roads. But that's mighty impressive. I mean, especially when you bear in mind that, well, both cars are essentially brand new. We've just come up quite a labouring climb towards this roundabout. So two things that aren't good for MPG: climbs and then slowing down and accelerating away from a roundabout. But this is a real life test, and we are keeping up with, if not going a little bit faster than the surrounding traffic. Let's continue a little bit of speed through here. It's not this one. Let's go around and then come off down here. Now we're into a 50. Cars love 50. 55 miles an hour is about as efficient as you can basically get. So 50 down here, I mean, even this car's reading 100 MPG or 99.5, which I think is as high as it gets. I was just saying that cars love 55 miles an hour, and down here, well, I think the car's just coasting actually, so I'm sure your one is as well. But while we're on that note, we're approaching a 20 mile mark, and mine is saying 34.7. What's yours saying?
I'm at 46.8 now.
But yeah, this is fascinating how they're both sort of synchronizing, keeping their gap between each other, and essentially reacting the same way to the road conditions. You now join me exactly 40 minutes after we first set off, and 30 miles later. We've done some motorway, we've done plenty of A roads, roundabouts, inclines, descents, bit of everything, traffic, but we both experience the same road conditions, so therefore it should in theory be very, very fair. I have averaged up to this point 36.6, which is a bit more than BMW claim, and therefore backs up the theory that I have WLTP figures are very accurate these days. So how does my 36.6 compare to what Jamie has? Jamie, what's your average saying now? I'm at 36.6. In fact, no, 36.8 I've gone up to.
I'm at 49.4.
Wow, that is impressive. Very, very impressive, because we've been sticking to the speed limit. We've been in a bit of traffic, roundabouts, all sorts of stuff. It hasn't been plain sailing, and that's just massively impressive. And once again, with my quick maths head on, I estimate that as being just over 30% more efficient than what or what I've produced in this car. So really does back up BMW's claims. And in both cases, in fact, both cars have done better in terms of efficiency than they claim, and better in terms of acceleration figures. So to summarize, which car is best? Well, the 340d still does make the most sense financially, because although diesel at the pump, as we discussed earlier on, is about 15% more expensive, the car on the move and in reality is about 30%, if not a little bit more, efficient. So therefore it is still cheaper to run no matter which way you look at it, especially as they both retail at about the same price, give or take a few quid, and they both finance at around the same costs as well. So in terms of costs, the M340d is the cheaper, more viable option. In terms of the way they feel, well, Jamie had a quick drive of this and he also agreed that this felt a little bit more nimble, front end felt a bit lighter. Obviously he's very familiar with his car, so it wasn't just me thinking that. The 340i does feel a little bit better, and that really is down to the fact that it has 75 less kilos hanging over the nose, so it makes more sense, or it makes sense. Something I didn't talk about much was the sound of both cars, and there's no denying that the i wins the sound contest, especially on the outside. I film the flybys and launches, and in fact you can't even hear the diesel. From inside, the diesel sounds pretty good, pretty meaty, but it just can't compete or compare with this M340i. It really does sound good, this car. So sound and handling, the M340i does just take it. But in terms of dailying and normal driving, the M340d is just mighty and definitely gets the win for me. It picks up from so low down, it's always there, it's always happy in drive, just cruising around. And if you loaded that car up with the 560 kilo payload, it would deal with that better than if this was fully laden because of that extra torque. But that's not taking anything away from this car, because it has plenty of torque, and that B58 just seems to do everything so well. There really isn't a winner. I was confused before this test, and I really didn't know what to tell people when they asked me M340i or M340d, and now after the test I'm just as confused. But it's been great to see everything sort of put into test, if you like. We've seen the acceleration figures, we've seen the efficiency figures, and they all tally up, if not a little bit better than what BMW suggests. So yeah, it's been an interesting afternoon for me. We only had both cars together for about 3.5 hours before the light decided to disappear. This car's going back to BMW in a couple of days' time. Massive thanks to Jamie, the owner of the M340d. Obviously I couldn't have done today without him and his car, so make sure you do go over and show some appreciation on his Instagram page, give him a follow, and yeah, let him know what you think of the spec of his car, because I think Brooklyn Grey with the Cognac leather and the M Sport seats are really nice. And thanks to you lot for watching and tuning in. As always, I will see you at another video very soon. Cheers.